Okay, good morning and welcome to Subversive Social Work, Critical Race Theory in Social Welfare Policy, Pedagogy, and Practice. I'm Dr. Stacy Alt, a retired-ish professor, community worker, youth worker, and public scholar. And I'm especially grateful for the interdisciplinary nature of this conference. I'm learning new things. I was telling my colleagues that Black women, when we feel out of control or overwhelmed, we go back to school. And so I have to talk myself out of joining law school now and taking the LSAT. So you all can hold me accountable to that. We are going to have essentially 3 presentations within this panel. The first, Critical Race Theory in Social Work, with myself, Susan, Larry, and Nicole. And then Cindy is going to talk about the stories behind the silence, specifically counter stories. And Summer will be sharing concrete and applied social work research. I am not going to introduce everyone for sake of time, but we will all introduce ourselves as we get started. As I mentioned, I am a retired-ish professor, so I'm Professor Emeritus from Sacramento State University. I took an early retirement in 2022 after my best friend died, and I decided, oh, y'all not gonna kill me. And so this work of integrating critical race theory into social work is really personal for me in our journey to impact the profession in a positive way. Our presentation is going to address social work history and the need for CRT. We're going to talk a little bit about the origins of critical race theory and social work scholarship. And then we are going to introduce our forthcoming book, Race, Power, and Practice, a Critical Race Framework for Social Work, that is being published by Cambridge University Press. I'm a Brit. I'm very excited about this. And share a little bit about the works of social workers within the profession that are integrating critical race theory in their practice, research, and pedagogy. I'm going to turn it over to Susan to introduce the social work history and the need for critical race theory.
All right, who are there social workers in the room or social welfare types? Okay, all right. Kind of almost everyone is at least some kind of social work type. But so I don't have to go, you'll probably know what I'm talking about when I say the failings of just professionalizing social welfare. But first I'll introduce myself. So I'm Susan Lades Nakaoka. I am with the social welfare department here. So I'm the practicum director. I teach a class, depending on the years, different classes, but last year I taught our critical theories class. And all 4 of us are co-founders of our Critical Race Scholars in Social Work network. So we do have kind of a professional national space to kind of convene, talk with each other, and share space, which we'll touch on a little bit later. Personally, I'm 3rd generation Japanese American and Chicana, so the whole history of indigenous history of my community and the World War II incarceration of my parents and their families really has impacted my work and kind of my ideas around race-based everything. And my educational training is social work, Asian American studies, and then my doctorate's urban planning. So that's kind of how I approach our field of social welfare. And kind of an unpopular opinion, I think, in social welfare is how we look at the history of social welfare. So from a critical race perspective, really professionalization of our field was kind of a big failure and kind of the beginning of the downfall of social welfare in our communities, right? The type that's empowering, the type of mutual aid, really complicated mutual aid systems that happened when people were enslaved, with indigenous people, with immigrant mutual aid societies. And it's usually taught, and it's still taught to this day, probably even in our school in some classes, that this is the origins of our profession, right? It's Hull House, it's settlement houses of community practice. It's this dichotomy between Jane Addams in the middle there, who was very kind of macro social worky, and then Mary Richmond on the right, who really kind of began this idea of casework or micro social work. And then when people started to say, hey, you're leaving out people then maybe we'll talk about Ida B. Wells, who was also in the progressive era, kind of had some banter with Jane Addams around anti-lynching campaigns, and was very important at the time. So I would definitely include Ida B. Wells, but I'd also include kind of a CRT perspective, would go back even further, right, and look into, and just common sense would tell you that there's other models of social welfare and social work that existed that even why we still are even here today, right? So in indigenous communities, there's a concept called survivance, where the resilience, the mutual aid really speaks to helping each other and how they got through those times. When people were enslaved, right? How did people provide health care, mental health care, food when they weren't being fed, child welfare, right? When people were separated from their families. And then immigrants and other, the example of different types of rotating credit associations where people would share pool money and then buy either start a small business, buy a watch or a suit to be more, have more ability to navigate white systems of power. And as early as the 1700s, organizations like Las Mutualistas in early Asian immigrant communities, these even consisted of like boarding houses, and a couple would run the boarding house, and the wife would cook the food and provide like kind of a surrogate parenthood to the immigrants that were coming for labor. And provided all of these services within community, culturally appropriate, and definitely very organized. Also in social welfare, I think that beginning of professionalization, not just the history of the beginnings of our profession, the history since that time of the professionalization of social work has really held up these white systems and exclusionary systems, right? Positing the deserving versus the undeserving poor in our policies and programs. The feminization of poverty, the racialization of poverty, and child welfare. Thinking about communities who are struggling and pathologizing those systems rather than looking at the systemic reasons why people make real rational decisions when they're faced with poverty and racism in schools, policing, all of those things. And then now universities, right, social welfare programs are kind of backsliding into, okay, let's do cultural competence, let's not say anti-racism. And even recently our accreditation body has said, well, we can't really make schools in red states do anti-racism as part of our hard-fought competency on anti-racism because that's against the law in their state. So I guess we're just going to still accredit them and they don't have to do that. So that's kind of a current battle we're currently helping. But it's important to kind of think the rest of our profession without a CRT lens is kind of still perpetuating and feeding into these systems. So at the beginning, we kind of had promised to do a little genealogy of CRT and social work, and the earliest there's 3 early articles that most of us cite. The first one in 2002, Canadian scholars Razak and Jeffrey talked about 8 tenets and applied those 8 tenets, or gave pretty good examples of applying them to social work. Abrams and Moyo in 2010, and Abrams, a professor here in social welfare, talked about how our profession has kind of gone through these different phases, the most recent one being, well, cultural competence is how we should deal with race. And they kind of problematize cultural competence as not enough, not even close, like not really targeting the systems of oppression, right? It's good to know, have cultural awareness, it's good to be trained in these things, but being competent is never really going to happen, and it's not really an issue of culture when we're talking about anti-racism and racism. And actually on our panel, we have the author of the 3rd article in 2010, Ortiz and Johnny, that really argued for using CRT in teaching in social work. So I'm going to hand it over to Larry Ortiz now, who's going to talk not only about the article, but the innovative program he started at Dominguez Hills focused on MSW and social welfare, CRT.
Thanks, Susan. Good morning. I'm Larry Ortiz, and I'm a professor of social work at Loma Linda University. And as a mixed person of Latino and Anglo origins, growing up in the Midwest, I experienced a tremendous amount of discrimination. Daily, being called names by the in-group, but being kind of regarded suspiciously by my out-group. identities. And I realized what a gift that was later in life, because it helped me to see the world in very interesting ways that I don't think I could have otherwise seen. And the story here, I think, is that it lends itself to my own progression through the profession and looking at what is the role, what is the purpose of diversity, what are we doing? And then as I moved into social work education, and I've been at social work education for probably more years than some of you have been alive, and I've seen the iterations of diversity content, and a lot of it used to be content where people taught about, well, today we're going to talk about Mexicans, and next week we're going to talk about Chinese, and then the next week we're going to talk about this. And we have like 1,000 groups all competing with each other for attention. So I used to call it, cynically, I used to talk about it as Taco Tuesday and Matzo Ball Thursday, Whatever happened to be the day, of the week, we'd get a different kind of flavor. And I've been involved in social work education for, like I said, for a long time, and I've been involved in curriculum development, I've been involved in accreditation. And one of the things that I started wrestling with is the superficiality of diversity. And the fact that none of it really led to justice. It always led to this kind of vague idea of cultural competence, of which I thought was a misnomer anyway. So I had a chance I was recruited by Dominguez Hills out of the University of Maryland. Well, okay, let me go back. At the University of Maryland, I was teaching doctoral students on curriculum development. And I started playing around with this idea. What happens if we took a theory, and that, a particular diversity theory, and that's what I called it at the time, and integrated it into all levels of the curriculum? And so that we're not just talking about content here and content there and siloed content, but it's integrated throughout with a justice focus. And it happened to be that my son was at a graduate student at the University of Notre Dame at the time and almost got kicked out because he wrote a paper on teaching critical race theory as a part of history to fourth graders. And it didn't go over very well. But anyway, so he said, "Dad, take a look at some of this literature." So that's what I did. And about that time, I was recruited by Dominguez Hills to come and begin their social work program. And so we hired a wonderful faculty, including Susan and later Nicole. And Cindy also was a part of that at different times. And we developed this model. We developed this curriculum that was fully integrated with CRT tenets. And we integrated it in every particular class and also in the field content. And that's a little bit of the genesis of where we began. And we were the first in the country to become accredited with this program, and it still is today. Yeah. Yes, it's Nicole.
Yeah. Thanks. I was wondering, can you see me? I'm standing on my tiptoe. Good afternoon. I'm Nicole Vasquez. I'm a graduate MSW MPP from here, Luskin, next door. My colleagues shared a little bit about our history. My introduction to CRT was it used to be the School of Public Affairs. There was a student-initiated, student-led class on critical race theory and public affairs. And it was beautiful and it was amazing. And it was students from social welfare, public policy, and urban planning. So then we got to, and Cindy and I were in the class together. And that was my first introduction to it, and it completely revolutionized the way I see social work, and now I say that CRT courses through my veins. It's interesting the way CRT, the rhetoric around it has changed, because CRT has made me a better social worker and actually made me more compassionate and loving human being. So this also originated, critical race scholars and social work originated through Susan and Larry going to CSWEs, our Council on Social Work Education, every year in our annual program meeting. It was kind of like there were little presentations on CRT and social work kind of here and there, but it's like, we don't know each other. Like, how do we come together? And I love it just came together so organically, through a couple of listservs. We sent out emails, and it was like, it wasn't a formal meeting, like this was taken in 2019 in the lobby of the Denver Hilton or whatever. Susan, we went and bought cookies, and it was like an old school sign-in sheet, a piece of paper with pens that we passed around, and that's how our listserv started. And from there grew Critical Race Scholars in Social Work. And it was really a way for us to connect. I mean, this was in 2019, right? So then when 2020 hit, we call it ChrisDub, lovingly we call it ChrisDub, became a lifeline for folks in states that were faculty. You can imagine faculty, sometimes they are the only ones who are interested in CRT, who are doing anti-racism work. So I'm very proud that, you know, the four of us are founding members of ChrisDub. It continues. We've taken a break in 2025 with the shit show that has been 2025. But we came together as a steering committee last week, and, you know, we want to continue all of the activities that we have been doing. So that's just an introduction to ChrisDub and to us, and then moving into our textbook. Actually, Susan and I were just communicating. I think that same year in 2019 was when I don't know what his title is, at Cambridge approached Susan to explore the possibility of doing a textbook in critical race theory and social work. And I'm so honored, you know, Susan and I have worked together, that, you know, I got asked to be a part of it. And we are officially, I guess, in production now. So hopefully, like, keep an eye out. It'll be out sometime next year. Probably a year or so from now. Our book is divided into 5 kind of parts or sections. This is what we call our meta, internally we call our meta section. Kind of just gives an overview of the tenets of social work. What we want to do today is focus more on each one of our sections that really goes deeper into connecting the tenets to social work, pedagogy, policy, and practice. And so the second part is Larry's section. Move it along back to him.
Hey again. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about section 2, which is the everydayness of racism. 2 tenets that we look at in that particular section have to do with the social construction of race and the ordinary and everyday nature of racism. The next slide. Oh, do I do that? Okay. Sorry.
I got you. Nice.
It always pays to be with people who know technology. Thank you so much. So in this chapter, in the introduction chapter, so the way the book is organized is there's a theoretical chapter that heads every major section. There's a meta chapter, which is part 1, which is complete overview and pretty in-depth. And then for each of the tenets that we cover, which are 5, we look at them in terms of a single section with praxis chapters, with example chapters that follow. So in this social construction, ordinary and everyday, in the theoretical chapter, what I try to focus in on is focus a little bit more on the upstream, because I kind of feel that is where the silent racism occurs. That's what I call the silent racism. It's kind of the assumptive world. People, you know, years ago, people didn't really question walking into a bank and getting a mortgage and wondering what the policies were like. They kind of said, well, there was all kinds of good reasons why redlining existed. Good reasons according to white normativity, right? And according to capitalism. These are the sorts of things that I believe that we really needed to focus in on. And I tried to use this within a social work context, using a social ecological model. And in social work, for those of you who have, there were many social work types here, you've had those models, the systems model, the systems theory, the micro through the meso to the macro. And so I wanted to focus a little bit more on the macro and identifying these silent racist systems in helping people, in hoping the students will be able to critique. Critique, what do we want them to critique? We want them to look at their practice theories. We want them to look at the practice interventions they engage in, the social policies, the research methods. We want them to be able to look at the assumptions upon which many of these theories are based are inherently white normative and hence racist. Okay? And so that's what we're hoping to achieve in that particular section. And then we have a series of articles or other chapters that are more praxis-oriented. Ebony's chapter on Redemption Road, it looks looks extensively at child welfare and the inherent racism in child welfare. The article on Present But Not Accounted For is about the inherent kind of tensions that occur within field when you have majority instructors in social work as students of color. We have a chapter on research, data justice and research, and that's a little bit more oriented towards quant crit. And then Hillary Weaver's chapter on dismantling colonial structures is focused a little more on indigenous ways of knowing. And now I think it's back to
Tag team.
yeah.
So my section this is the title of the section. The two tenets that I focus on here are critique of liberalism and interest convergence. These are the ones for the social workers in the room. It's like really hard to translate critique of liberalism and what that actually looks like in social work practice. So that was my challenge, and I can thank my colleagues for helping me through that. But it's really the praxis of critical race theory and social work is understanding the macro to the micro. And so starting with, the foundational understandings, right? When we look at liberalism, like the liberal values and constructs that lay the foundation for our neoliberal welfare state and subsequently social welfare policies. So a perfect example, I think, of that was welfare reform, the Personal Responsibility Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996. So President Clinton, when he passed it, our Democratic president, this was a quote, that, and so even in the name, right, personal response, like that speaks directly to liberalism, personal responsibility, work opportunity. So tying welfare and support to women in particular, right, and families and children to these liberal values of work responsibility, focus on the individual responsibility, the rugged individualism, bootstraps, all of that bullshit, right, is like laid into our public policies. So laying that foundation and then translating that to social work practice was like understanding that, because as social workers, we, kind of just, if you aren't taught in the CRT tradition, right, we're kind of just taught to just do what we're told, right? We go into systems, we go into these agencies and these organizations. Like part of my background is working in family preservation. So family preservation program with DCFS here, Department of Children and Family Services, like families that have cases with DCFS, and we just come in and do the work, and we're part of this child welfare policing system. So then it's understanding the foundation and then getting our social work students and social workers, right, to do that honest, critical self-reflection. Like once we understand, then how am I being complicit in these systems, right? Being honest with ourselves of how am I doing that? So with our textbook too, we have, practice questions and things like that start to interrogate that. So ultimately we can try to tear this down. And then these are our invited, and I just love looking at the pictures of our invited authors, right? They're beautiful, and these are our colleagues. A lot of them are members of CRISTUB. The various chapters within invited author chapters within my section look at just TikTok, social media, and how tying again and understanding social work tenets with social media, education, immigration policy, and public policy, you know, with Jason Plummer's chapter there at the end. But again, it's like that micro or macro to micro is like understanding systems and policies like immigration, education, and what that kind of looks like in social work practice and how we can interrogate that and foster these discussions. And really, that for me, the really important critical self-reflection that needs to happen with social work in order to practice social work differently. So, Susan's next.
Okay, my section was intersectionality, which is made a little easier because in Crenshaw's Mapping the Margin, she also actually gives the example, right, of domestic violence being an area that needs intersectionality. So we look at it in this section as a technique to which academic students, practitioners can identify specific intersections to define within their praxis how you can use intersectional frameworks, right, to be a critical practitioner. So redefining eligibility is one easy way to look at intersectionality. All of our programs, our agencies are so siloed. So you do youth programs, you do mental health. If you work for the VA, you only learn about military social work, right? And it's never kind of all of these things put together. So how do we look at eligibility for a shelter for the houseless if they're not going to accept undocumented immigrants, or they have, I think the example on Crenshaw's article is that one of the qualifications for being in a DV shelter is that you have to attend groups and they're only in English, right? So does that mean you're not going to accept someone who doesn't speak English? Are there abilities for trans youth or queer parents, queer immigrants to participate in X, Y, and Z? Oftentimes in social welfare programs, sometimes intersectionality is we need to look at ourselves, we need to be critically reflexive, and students get very involved in knowing their own identities pretty well, but not as much as in terms of how you apply that then to populations. Are you really thinking critically? And then are you doing it all the time? And one kind of intersection that gets left out of a lot of our literature is poverty, right? Social work students don't often learn about poverty. They're not critical about poverty. They do kind of follow these more traditional liberal notions of merit-based programming, work, aid, cash aid. So learning more critically about poverty and then using that in your intersectional praxis is super important, because really poverty is that line across all of our populations. And then thinking critically about different ways these markers show up all the time, right? So you might have someone who is a particular race, gender, class, etc., but it still looks different than someone with those same identities. So the example I like to give is when I was a master's student, my master's thesis was on Japanese American women who are political activists. And they were activists at a time in the 70s to get Japanese Americans redressed for the camp experience. And my initial thought was, well, these are very atypical Japanese American women. We think of Asian women as being quiet, passive, not political, not activists. So there's something unusual about these women, right, was how I went into the project. And very quickly, the women who were all in their 70s and 80s when I interviewed them, because this was in the late 90s, said, oh, I'm so typical Japanese. I have all the values, and I went back to school because my father said I had to be an example to my younger siblings. So she was the eldest daughter, right? Another woman whose father was a little more well off was an only child. The father didn't have a son. So the father put all of his interest of having a college-age child into the woman, which, at that time in the 40s was not common for any women. So the same thing, different birth order, different situation, but she thought, oh, I have such filial obligation, right? I'm very typical. I did what my dad told me to do. Another one was religious, right, and Christian, and she thought being a role model in the Japanese Christian church was important. So when things were happening to her community, it was up to her to stand up. But to her, that was, again, very Japanese American. I have to be there for my community. I have to do service. So even though they were all college educated, I think 4 of the 5 ended up getting a master's degree. Again, this is from the 40s to the 70s where they were getting their education. They were vocal, they were activists. In different ways, they all thought they were pretty typical. So that intersectionality, I still wrote up my thesis with an intersectional lens, but how you define what did race mean to them, what did culture, what did class, because they all kind of came to the war with different class definitions and then their families lost everything in the war. But how they responded to that had something to do with those backgrounds and how they saw their intersectional lens, right? So it's always different, and they could show up differently all the time. So unless you're really thinking critically about that, I think you miss a lot. Our chapters did a good job of that, though. So our first chapter is kind of a historical look back. One of our MSW alums, Carlos Amador, is an immigrants' rights activist, and he was an undocumented student when he was an MSW student here. And he was very active in the DREAM Act movement. So leading up to the 2010 kind of failed vote, the closest we ever got to a federal DREAM Act vote, and he talks about that movement and what students did during that time. And I think the DREAM Act and immigrant rights does a really good job of putting, and Carlos in particular, putting women first, putting queer immigrants first. They really understand this idea of intersectionality and how it relates to immigration. Experiencing academia at the intersection of race, class, gender, and nationality. Monique Constance Huggins is a scholar at, I'm forgetting her university, Winthrop University, also a Black immigrant, and one of the early scholars of CRT. I think her article came out a couple years after Larry's, and talks about her own, a very personal story about how her own intersections of being an immigrant, and specifically a Black immigrant in academia. The next one, out of Portland, I think most of the scholars out of Portland State define queer Asian crit and talk about radical possibilities for social work, and they definitely infuse lots of intersectionality in their kind of establishing this model. And then finally, we fought really hard to get a disability justice chapter in here. It took a lot because most people who do disability and this type of work are super busy because there's not a lot of them. So I know we asked a lot of great people, including Bianca, who's here, and other folks, and someone else who talked on a panel yesterday. And they graciously recommended other people, and then we were able to get this chapter in about kind of defining critical race disability in social work. So we're excited about that. And part 5.
So in part 5, we're really looking at reflexivity, positionality, and the social worker. My journey to critical race theory came rather late. I went back to school at 42 for a doctoral degree at USF. And I was born and raised in the UK, so came up with a very class-conscious, socialist sort of worldview. And it wasn't until I came to California, I was a high school dropout, I was a teen parent, I was one of Bill Clinton's welfare moms. But it wasn't until critical race theory that I understood the problematic nature of this class-conscious view only, which I think is also perpetuated inside of social work. We know and have talked a little bit about communities of color having deep healing traditions and resistances that have been often erased by social work and replaced by this professionalism, right? Like this professional view of the work that we do. And we lean into Lou here, who talks about the rise of the professional managerial class and sort of this, we're doing this work in our communities, in our indigenous practices, and once it becomes professionalized and paid, now we can create the nonprofit industrial complex, right, which makes us then complicit in this journey of social work to sort of get paid, get promoted, and to continue perpetuating these inequities. And so this chapter, or this section, really forces us to examine how social workers and service users have to be at the center of knowledge creation and knowledge production, the importance of participatory and community, whether it's youth and or community research and research methodologies, which was my doctoral work that really struggled within social work professions to be considered, or programs to be considered as rigorous enough for the work that we were doing. And then finally, as social workers, we are storytellers, we're story collectors, right? That's an innate part of what we do. But we don't always center the importance of storytelling as cultural techniques beyond the power dynamic of me sharing my story with an expert who then gives me advice on how I can heal. The chapters within this section are focusing on critical race praxis. So what are some actual tools that social workers can use to incorporate critical race theory into their practice? biracial identities and how we can use complex, nuance, critical race theory to examine anti-blackness and colorism as we negotiate identities for ourselves as practitioners and then also with our clients. And indigeneity and critical race theory. And Paula and Peter really push us to complicate even critical race theory in terms of when critical race theory isn't applied with an indigenous paradigm, it can become a colonial project as well, right? And then the last chapter within this book is my favorite, which is centering rest in our critical social justice work practice. And so how do we use critical race theory as an examination of our own rest and think about self-care, Dr. Melissa Harris Perry's work around squad care and systemic change in our own healing and our own work. I'm going to pass it on now to, I have a conclusion. Okay, I'm talking really fast. A few minutes? I got a 1 minute. I'm okay?
You're okay.
Okay, good. So in closing, we push to this praxis of critical hope. And so I'll lean to Freire here, who says, I am hopeful not out of mere stubbornness, but out of an existential, concrete imperative. Hope is necessary, but it is not enough. Alone, it does not win, but without it, my struggle will be weak and wobbly. We need critical hope, critical race hope, the way a fish needs unpolluted water. And we'll conclude our section of this presentation by leaning into Derek Bell. We talked about at the very opening of this program, marginalized identities and Derek Bell's work. And so I'll leave you with, we emphasize our marginality and try to turn it towards advantageous perspective building and concrete advocacy on behalf of those oppressed by race and other interlocking factors of gender, economic class, and sexual orientation. When I say we are marginalized, it is not because we are victim mongers seeking sympathy in return for a sacrifice of pride. Rather, we see such identification as one of the only hopes of transformative resistance strategy. And so if you are in this intersection of critical race theory and social work, I will invite you to consider how you can apply the tenets to your social work practice and how can critical race theory allow you to examine not only the world, not only yourself, which is common in social work, but also the work around you and its impact on the work that we do. I'm going to pass it on to Cindy, and I should probably help while Cindy, you're coming up. I'll look for your presentation. Nope, not that one. And we're going to hold questions until the end, so we'll have an opportunity to kind of dialogue once we're all done.
All right, wow, thank you. Thank you so much for that foundation. Let me get situated here. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Cindy Sangalang. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm an assistant professor here at UCLA in the departments of social welfare and Asian American studies. I'm delighted to be here with my amazing colleagues and mentors here. My presentation is entitled The Stories Behind the Silence, Cultivating Counter-Narratives in the Classroom for Collective Healing. And it's based on a course that I developed in the spring of 2025. It's my first time actually presenting about this course, so I'm very excited, also very nervous, and I'll be drawing on some of my notes here. But it really is an honor to share some insights from this experience, highlighting how counter-narratives can foster healing in educational spaces. Before moving on, I'd like to begin with some acknowledgements. First, I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Los Angeles, the Los Angeles region, the Tongva people, past and present, and that we honor with gratitude the land itself and the Tongva Nation. I also want to offer deep appreciation for scholars and mentors who who shaped my intellectual and political grounding in critical race theory and social work. In particular, Mari Matsuda, whose pieces such as Looking to the Bottom, which offered a foundational framework for understanding race, history, and power from the standpoint of the most marginalized, as well as Planet Asian America, which was really a love letter and a call to action for Asian Americans that continues to inspire me today. I give thanks to Larry Ortiz, who gave me my first teaching job at Cal State Dominguez Hills, as he had mentioned that rich history, and also in demonstrating how mentorship and institutional access are part of CRT praxis. To Jennifer J. Garcia and Nicole Vasquez for sharing with me my first steps in learning about CRT in that student-initiated course many moons ago in the spring, I think, of 2007 here at UCLA, when we were hungry grad students to learn more about what was happening here in the School of Law and the Critical Race Studies program that had launched here, wanting to apply CRT to social work and other professional applied fields. And then finally to Susan Nakaoka, a colleague and role model who really embodies social justice practice in her daily teaching, leadership and relationships, really modeling what it means to live this work and not just study it. And finally, I want to shout out my community collaborators, past and present, including Filipino Migrant Center, Khmer Girls in Action, as well as my students, some of whom are here, I'm very excited, who've all contributed stories with me and from who I am continuously grateful to be learning. I wanted to name my mentors and colleagues who have made it possible for me to see differently, which is in part the essence of counter-storytelling and counter-narrative. So this was actually the title of the course that I taught, Beyond Trauma, Resilience and Healing in Asian and Pacific Diasporic Communities. And I was able to create this course through the Asian American Studies Department. So I want to explain that in terms of the origins, the course grew out of a piece that I wrote that was eventually published in Nature, which required extensive research into trauma, historical memory, and community resilience. And in this piece, I offer a vision for advancing the field of trauma to move beyond narrow psychiatric perspectives, really building on the work of other foundational scholars and thinkers, but also drawing on historical memory, community resilience, and doing so through interdisciplinary inquiry and community-informed perspectives, while really underscoring the need to attend to historical and cultural contexts of collective trauma, particularly in light of a growing emphasis on biological and epigenetic explanations. So importantly, I call for greater attention to diverse populations affected by mass traumas and advocate for the inclusion of methodological approaches that really capture the complexity of communities' experiences of trauma collectively and over time. So that process of translating these scholarly ideas for a broader audience really planted the seed for a course that would invite students to do the same, to really bridge scholarship, storytelling, and lived experience. And to provide some context as well for the course, we were meeting under the specter of ICE raids in Los Angeles, which weighed heavily on many students, particularly our immigrant students and faculty and staff here, and their families and communities. We were just 1 year removed from the university's disastrous response to pro-Palestinian student encampments, which left lasting wounds around belonging and speech and solidarity. And of course, the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, the racial reckoning following the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and the continuing struggles to affirm that Black Lives Matter. And for some, these moments to continue to bear weight on communities, and they shape how we enter the classroom and what the students and I carry. So with that in mind, I designed a course with the aim of really, again, taking on an interdisciplinary approach to understanding trauma, resilience, and healing within Asian and Pacific diasporic communities. And it was designed to ask questions such as, how do we understand trauma in ways that center these diasporic experiences? How do intergenerational historical traumas shape the social and health realities of our communities today? And how might resilience, memory, and healing serve not only as responses, but as practices of survival and resistance? And as a scholar situated at the intersection of social work and ethnic studies, my intention was both practical and existential. I wanted students, many of whom would go on to become practitioners, educators, artists, really citizens of the world, to understand the science and scholarship of trauma in a way that truly centers the lived experiences and histories of these communities. And existentially, I also hope to offer a space for making sense of the uncertainty and precarity that defines our current moment. And in doing so, I drew on trauma-informed care to inform my pedagogical approach that emphasized safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. So at the core of this course was a recognition that the silencing of historical and collective traumas, especially in Asian and Pacific diasporic context, is not accidental. It's a function of whiteness, which operates as a dominant structure of knowledge production in academia and beyond, and it determines which stories are seen as credible, whose pain is legible, and whose histories are worth remembering. In Richard Delgado's 1989 piece, Storytelling for Oppositionists and Narrative, and Others, a Plea for Narrative, he reminds us that, quote, oppressed groups have known instinctively that stories are an essential tool to their own survival and liberation. Silencing is central to how white supremacy sustains itself by erasing and distorting historical and ongoing impacts of colonialism, racial capitalism, and imperialism. And when these narratives are absent, communities are left to carry their traumas without the language or frameworks to name them. So in this course, I wanted to push beyond conventional medicalized understandings of trauma, most often associated through the lens of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, which locates trauma solely within the individual psyche. And while this framework is useful, it really limits our understanding of the social and environmental dimensions of traumatic experiences and their aftermath. So to address this limitation, we turn to thinkers like Frantz Fanon, the psychiatrist and political intellectual born in 1925 in Martinique, whose writings such as Black Skin, White Masks, and The Wretched of the Earth reveal the profound psychological and cultural costs of colonization. And Fanon helps us trace the political and social origins of trauma, continues to help us trace those origins, showing that what we often call psychological distress is in fact a response to colonial violence. And so again, in our class, we used insights from Fanon as a starting point to interrogate how trauma is not simply an individual or clinical phenomenon, but a structural and political condition. I also drew on two key understandings of trauma that move beyond individual models, collective trauma and historical trauma, and I'll explain them very briefly. Collective trauma, as described by Hirschenberger, refers to psychological reactions to a traumatic event that affect an entire society. Trauma, in this context, has a broad societal impact. It becomes woven into a group's identity and worldview, and the community continually works to understand and integrate the experience over time. And similarly, historical trauma, articulated by Braveheart and Evans Campbell, offer a way to understand how the cumulative and emotional psychological wounding of a group across generations becomes embodied, transmitted, and remembered. And originating in indigenous scholarship and practice, this framework resonates across diasporic communities whose histories are marked by colonization, displacement, and war. So these frameworks were essential to the course, and within a CRT framework, again, that centers counter-narrative, these understandings of trauma reveal how structural forces such as racism, imperialism, but also our migration policies and economic inequities produce ongoing harms that not only require treatment, but truth-telling. And that's where counter stories come in as a way to name what's been silenced, to remember what's been fragmented, and to restore agency to communities that have long been spoken for or made invisible. So just to briefly talk about some of the topics and readings that we covered, we learned more about the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, and the intergenerational impacts of racial surveillance and dispossession, to the experiences of survivors of China's Cultural Revolution, navigating state violence, silence, and exile, to the partition of India, which fractured families, nations, and identities across borders, the historical trauma of Native Hawaiians, rooted in the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, and the ongoing impacts of U.S. occupation, to the Khmer Rouge genocide in Cambodia and its intergenerational reverberations across refugee and diasporic communities, the secret war in Laos and its devastating consequences among the Hmong people, the so-called forgotten war in Korea, whose legacies of division and militarization continue to haunt diasporic memory, and to Palestinian resistance in the face of ongoing military occupation, systemic violence, and genocide, which continues to demand global recognition of historical and present-day injustices. Counterstoring was, again, a key part of our course, and here I highlight the definition provided by Solorzano and Yoso from 2002, where they say, we define counterstory as a method of telling the stories of those people whose experiences are not often told. In other words, those on the margins of society. The counterstory is also a tool of exposing, analyzing, and challenging the majoritarian stories of racial privilege. Ortiz and Akaoka also discussed the use of narrative and experiential knowledge to counter dominant perspectives, and within education, research has really proliferated around people of color's experiences as a valid source of knowledge, particularly in centering analyses of race and racism, with examples, as mentioned earlier, in terms of testimonio rooted in Chicana feminism, and kwentuhan originating in the indigenous Filipino tradition of storytelling. So in our course, we asked challenging questions in part because of the ways in which these broader histories were intertwined with our own family histories. And so in order to really set the stage for the course, I had to be very intentional about grounding it, again, in trauma-informed approaches, but wanting to really emphasize relational learning, individual and collective reflection, dialogue, and community building. So one successful strategy I wanted to share that I learned was to bring food. We literally were breaking bread on the first day. And thereafter, it was a very organic process where I would bring something and then others in the class would also bring food as well to share. Across classes each week, I started off with a practice of being together in silence for 90 seconds. So folks who are in my small seminars know I like to have this 90 seconds of silence to help ground us and allow us to really, quote unquote, sort of enter the space together as a group. I also incorporated various somatic practices such as breath work and body scans to provide practical tools for students to manage stress, to increase mindfulness, and to help self-soothe, always emphasizing that we should do what we need to take care of ourselves in the moment. And early on and throughout, I underscored core values, particularly listening as an act of justice, and working toward what Francisco Menchavez calls a community of care, a form of collective care that highlights small everyday acts of care in which people come together out of survival and resistance, but also to heal together. We constructed community agreements as a group to provide that foundation for engaging in dialogue and discussion with one another and for sharing stories. And the course ultimately drew undergraduates and grad students who were diverse in cultural backgrounds, lived experiences, and familiarity with the points of entry with the topics that we discussed. And here I just wanted to highlight a quote that I shared on our first day This is a quote from Browning et al.'s Little Book of Listening, where they say to listen, or listen justly, is to intentionally launch ourselves into unknown territory, to dwell in the unfolding possibility of every encounter with a desire and willingness to be changed. Welcome to this journey. There were a number of activities and assignments that I would love to highlight, but I'll briefly discuss a few that are simple that can be adapted in a number of classroom contexts. An early activity we engaged in as a group was the name activity. It's actually an activity that I use in my intergroup dialogue course and social work all the time. It's simple, but it's always so powerful, where students are paired up and I ask them to take turns sharing the story of their name, first name, middle name, last name, whatever feels most meaningful in the moment to them. And each person takes about 3 to 5 minutes to share what their partner just learned. And so the listener's main task is to listen deeply without interrupting, asking questions or jumping in with their own connections. And then folks switch roles. So students are able to really go beyond surface layers of meaning that often go unspoken in terms of stories behind who named them and why, their families' migration journeys, broader histories, or cultural values embedded in their names. The way names have been mispronounced, changed, or erased, and how that connects to belonging, identity, and power. And for the final project, just as an example assignment, I invited students to create and share a story, whether individual, familial, or a community-based narrative that drew on themes from the course in a format that felt authentic and meaningful to them. So really opening it up in an inclusive way, and the projects took on many different forms: photo collages, zines, spoken word pieces, poetry anthologies, abbreviated autoethnographies, and interviews with elders of family members. And ultimately, these projects became acts of remembrance and reconnection, a form of narrative healing and community care. So I'll just briefly conclude with some thoughts in terms of reflecting on this course and the role of counter stories as praxis. It really went beyond just being a method, but was a form of meaning making for many of us through memory work, through making art, through community building. We were able to really create a space where these stories of trauma and resilience could coexist. The experience for me also underscored how we have a responsibility to learn these histories of collective violence and not to dwell in harm, but to witness and remember, even as we see repetition in our current moment. And through students' counter stories, they revealed that trauma and healing were not linear paths. They're often cyclical, layered, and often contradictory. And our task as educators, as social workers, and community members is to hold space for that complexity and for multiple truths. And ultimately, this course really reaffirmed that our stories deserve to be told, and the act of telling and truly listening is itself a form of resistance and repair. So again, I wanted to thank the CRT scholars and my colleagues here, and for planting the seeds of counter storytelling so that it could be spread with our students and beyond. Thank you. Oh, and I had visuals of resistance here in the community. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Sitong Summerson. I use they, them pronouns. I am assistant professor at Luskin Social Welfare. And I'm really gonna focus on adding on to all the wonderful presentations here. An offshoot of CRT called Concrete and how to apply them in applied social research and some empirical examples and policy implications. Yeah, I don't know why it's
Switched on it.
swap. Okay, thank you. Well, before I begin, I just really want to share my positionality and my relation to this area of work. I was born and raised in China. I'm a first-generation Chinese immigrant. I came to the United States 10 years ago. Before I moved to California, I spent almost 10 years in the Midwest. So before I came to the United States, I have no idea about what is race or what is racism. And then through my experience in the Midwest and my learning and also my observation, I realized, oh, I'm an individual racialized as Asian in the context of the United States. I'm also a first-generation college student and a non-binary queer scholar and educator. My story to my introduction to CRT is not through social work, not surprised because I got trained in the Midwest institutions. So actually my first introduction to CRT is my mentor, Dr. Hudson, from public health. So that's my first introduction to CRT and how to apply them into research. So as a newish assistant professor, I always like to put myself in the shoes of students. And I just want to say how incredibly grateful I would be to have a CRT textbook in social work. So thank you so much, Stacy, Susan, Larry, and Nicole for laying this groundwork in the field. And also, as a student, I would be so grateful to be in Cindy's class as well. As I'm listening to her describing the class, I already feel the embodiment of healing just being in this room. So just how incredibly privileged and humble and grateful I am here today, just to share a little bit about my research here. So my research is really rooted in interdisciplinary collaboration and anti-racism. And some empirical examples I give today will be focused on racial equity in socioeconomic status and health outcomes. And my research focuses on macro social work and population health. So some of the concrete content will be based on this article that's just published this month. And if you're interested, you can scan the QR code or reach out to me. I'm happy to share the PDF. Okay, so before I formally define concrete, I want to acknowledge that concrete philosophies and practices have existed in the work of BIPOC scholars for over a century. And the picture to the right is Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois and some foundational texts that really interrogate the relationship between statistics and policy and research and narratives. So concrete it emerged in the field of education, and the credit often goes to Gilbourne and colleagues, Castillo and Gilbourne. The key insight of quantitative critical race theory is the decision about what data are released, how they are classified, and how they are presented. Shape findings are not neutral, and sometimes can mark institutional systemic racism. And the emphasis on power highlights how institutions use metrics and categories in which that produce or reproduce race and racism. And there have been applications of concrete in various social issues such as school-to-prison pipeline, No Child Left Behind, indigenous erasure, housing insecurity, and well-being of Black boys. And I just want to also mention the history of statistics, and it's oftentimes being used alongside in the eugenics movement and the scientific racism. That still have its impact till this day, from my opinion. So why concrete? So according to my colleagues' book chapter about critical methodology, that dominant research paradigms, especially positivism, grew from European traditions, from the move of the Enlightenment and scientific methods. And positivism enabled major advances and also privileged Eurocentric ways of knowing, at the same time marginalizing BIPOC knowledge systems. These conventions are widely standard in a lot of disciplines. However, it's not neutral. They are shaped by context, power, and positionality. And just some notes on epistemic justice. I'm sure there will be tons of textbook or a whole course about this, but I just invite you all to question and reflect what knowledge is valid, how is knowledge processed, and who is seen as knowledgeable. I won't repeat the CRT tenets my colleagues just shared, so I want to share the tenets and praxis of quant-crit. So first, because racism is ordinary, everyday racism, it is really hard to measure race in the context of systemic racism. The non-neutrality of numbers and statistical processes that researchers bring their own humanity and positionality in the various decision-making process when we're running statistical analysis. And also statistical categories are neither neutral nor natural. Data cannot speak for themselves, that it's up to humans who are interpreting them and presenting them. And also another tenet is commitment to social justice and equity. In addition, centrality of racism and the goal of quant-crit is to challenge dominant ideology and the deep commitment to advancing equity and material conditions of the BIPOC communities. Applying intersectionality into analysis. Research liminality is specifically for BIPOC researchers that have this dual role of being as a BIPOC in the society and also as a researcher has power in relation to the study participants. And finally, quant-crit also encourage interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary collaborations. So next, I'm going to share some really practical recommendations derived from the quant-crit. And I don't know how many researchers are in this room, and some colleagues of mine have already heard this presentation on Monday, so I'm just going to be really brief. So first, the first tenet of the quant-crit I shared that is really challenging to measure race in the context of racism. So this work is from Ross 2016, and that shows that it's really, race has so many dimensions. And this is a quote from an article by Dr. Detrick Williams that asks how race is constructed, for whom, and to what end. And from my observation in my own research, that most practices are using racial self-classification, using closed-ended survey item as a proxy for racial identity. However, there are so many other dimensions of race and how we measure race and racism. So in light of that, some recommendations for research or interpreting quant article results. Before you start the project, me and my co-author really recommend clearly define race and ethnicity at the start of the research and contextualize them within the historical and structural racism. And also consider different dimensions of race and ethnicity. It's impossible to measure every single dimension in a single research project, right? But it's also important to acknowledge what are some of the limitations given how you measure race in your own research. Also collect quality disaggregated race and ethnicity data wherever possible. And too often times we see communities are systemically being recategorized into the other group, for example, indigenous communities. Asian Pacific Islander, multiracial groups. And then also acknowledge the limitations of using race as a proxy for racism, and also make sure that individual level of self-identification can be contextualized within the broader system and structural levels of racism. And next, in terms of data analysis, I also invite researchers in the room to consider whether it's really appropriate to treat race as a control variable. Another dimension of the data analysis in terms of thinking about samples is to use both within group and between group analysis wherever possible. Avoid deficit-based comparisons that treat whiteness as the default. Instead, focus on structural inequities. And using white as a reference is not inherently anti-concrete, but also I encourage you all to think about how to critically examine white dominance, not to reinforce whiteness as the normative. I think some other panelists have mentioned this before. Also, avoid counterfactual frameworks in racial equity research that treat whiteness as a neutral, unexposed control group. The counterfactual thinking of asking what would happen if people racialize as black or racialize as white, treat whiteness as the neutral, unexposed group. However, it doesn't really measure white privilege among the white sample. And because of avoiding counterfactual framework is the recommendation, that's why we recommend also performing intra or within group analysis or comparative analysis across different racial ethnic groups. And also, in light of intersectionality, consider other social identities that intersect with race, such as gender, SES, nativity, etc. And next, we have data cannot speak for themselves, right? So in terms of finding interpretations that emphasize systemic factors over inherent racial characteristics to avoid biological essentialism or cultural inferiority when interpreting findings. And also use critical theories to interpret racial differences through racial conscious anti-racist lens. Also, involve diverse stakeholders, including community members in data interpretation. Use participatory approaches. A lot of those practices are very common in the qualitative research. But because positivism also frame quantitative research as objective, that oftentimes I think researchers think they can remove themselves from the community they study. Thus, we also recommend to write a positionality statement even in quantitative research to acknowledge the researcher's perspective, biases, and relationship to the study population. And finally, in terms of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary collaborations, that review literature from diverse disciplines to gain broader insights and foster collaborations that enhance the depth and impact of the research. I'm going to show two brief empirical examples and talk about some of the policy implications for my own research. So my research really focused on the intersections of racism, wealth, and health, really focusing on the wealth building policy. How can we use a critical race lens to interrogate the wealth inequities in the US? So this is an example of using a cross-group analysis, but also with the goal of framing it as a structural issue. Wealth inequity is a structural issue. It's not up to individuals' financial literacy, or you can budget all you want, but if systemically policies exclude people from wealth-building opportunities, then it is not an individual behavior or traits. Like we should focus on the structure. And here is an example of within group analysis, but also comparing the patterning across different racial ethnic groups. So this is an example of odds ratio between the relationship between wealth and health by different racial ethnic groups. And you can observe that in the non-Hispanic white sample, there is this stepwise incremental association, like better wealth leads to better health. However, for the non-Hispanic black sample, only if they were in the highest quartile among their own group can it be protective of health outcomes. And when we're talking about the highest quartile among the black sample, it means actually the second quartile in the white sample. That's leading to the implications of progressive wealth building policies, such as baby bonds and black reparations. And for the Hispanic sample, I found interesting results that parental net worth was not statistically significant associated with health. However, individuals' own net worth during the age of 20 to 30 were the significant predictors of health. And here is another example from another article that I really want to show in terms of debt. So in this research piece that I found, that you can see the dotted blue line, which represent non-Hispanic white sample, that owing unsecured debt during the age of 20 to 30, mostly student loans, were positively associated with health outcomes. However, it was negative and detrimental for health for all people of color, and specifically for the non-Hispanic black young adults. So in terms of policy implication, that we talk about poverty in social work, right? I don't think we talk about asset a lot. Like we oftentimes think about income as we're thinking about poverty. So in terms of asset-based social policy, the purpose is for long-term security and hope for the future, right? For example, college education, first-time home purchase, retirement. And in the US, asset-based policies are not new. Actually, this graph shows that the four largest tax incentives that build wealth, for example, tax deferrals for 401k and IRA, home ownership, primarily the home mortgage interest tax deduction, 529 college savings, and investment. Those four largest tax incentives that build wealth, that 80% of the benefits goes to top 20% of income earners. And usually, like, we don't talk about this. It's like excluded from public scrutiny. But think about how much money the wealthy people are taking advantage of in the tax system compared to how much we're spending on social safety net. So a question to ask is, why not building assets for everyone? And how can we do something about it in terms of thinking about policy? Inclusive asset-based policy, like how can we make sure everyone is included, not just those privileged ones? How can we make it progressive, so provide more subsidies for the disadvantaged populations? And using a critical race conscious lens to think about the policy design. And also, how can we build assets from as early as possible so people can take advantage of the compounding interest that grows over time. So I mentioned some policy proposal examples, child development accounts, which is right now 7 U.S. states have statewide child development accounts. And very recently, if you have heard of Trump accounts, is a federal level policy that's also thinking about building assets for babies. Both policy proposals, such as baby bonds and black reparations, large wealth transfer to the historically harmed and excluded populations. And here's an example of California, CalKids. In 2022, California launched a new policy called CalKids, and a lot of the public school students and newborns after July 1st, 2022 are eligible. So if you're interested, welcome to come talk to me after the presentation so we can get you some money for your family or kids' future education. And this is my ongoing research to think about how to apply all those quant crit and also critical race consciousness into policy. Okay, some conclusions. Quantitative methods used critically and reflexively can advance racial, social, economic health, equity, and justice. And how can we build intentional, justice-oriented research practices that are accountable to communities that we serve and drive systemic change, not just the band-aids. And finally, I hope this short presentation can inspire some interdisciplinary and cross-sector collaborations because everything is connected, intersecting public systems to achieve racial justice in socio-economic health outcomes. Thank you so much. Here's my contact info.
I think we have about 10 minutes for discussion and questions. What do y'all think? What's sitting with you right now? Yeah, jump in.
Hi, I'm a student in the social welfare department here, and thank you all for the work that you do. In undergrad, I studied ethnic studies, so critical race studies is something I really care about, and it's definitely something that I've felt a bit missing from my courses. And I think the critique is there, and conversations are being had, but I think, of course, right, there's a lot of paradoxes within social work as a whole apparatus. And so something for me that's coming up as someone with 2 disabilities is my first time learning of discrit was yesterday at the talk, and which is, I'm grateful that this scholarship exists, but like you mentioned, there's not very many people talking about it, and right, the institution of social welfare is creating the social constructions of ableism, and so yeah, I'm right in my first year, we're learning so much of the DSM and all of it, the medical model, and I hear this conversation around we're moving away from it, but we're not talking about disability justice. I don't think we're talking too much about the intersections of disability justice and racial justice. And I do feel like I have really wonderful, amazing professors that are doing that work, and and then I also feel like it's still missing. And so I'm wondering, right? There's of course the scholarship that exists and the people who are really behind this work. But why is it that we're still really struggling to have this more integrated in our programming, in the curriculums? Why, like in my DSM classes, I'm like, why aren't we talking about this? Like, why are we not talking about the ways that this is replicating the internalized ableism for all of us who have disabilities and making it so hard to actually heal and get anywhere? And the way the institution itself is making it very difficult for people like myself to be successful with, accommodations.
Yeah.
So sorry, I'm like ranting.
No, thank you for that question. Does anyone want to jump in?
Never say well first. That means you go first. Your point is really obviously spot on. Well taken. Somebody talked about epistemic privilege, and I think it kind of has to begin at that level of critiquing what is truth and what is worthy to know. And that's part of what I think. To me, that's the first thing that jumps out to me with your question. Is unless we interrogate that process of what is truth and what is worthy to know, then we are going to always default to what we do know. The default position is the white narrative, the white, the master narrative, the white normativity, the DSM, the ableism. That's the narrative that is the default if we do not critique the privilege of knowing. And so, it does take the process. That's why I was talking earlier about moving up the social systems framework for analysis, because those things are silent. They just kind of like professors go into classrooms and we pick up the material based on the literature that we've read and the research that we've done, in knowing that it was evidence-based practice. The evidence-based methodology is itself, colonialistic. It comes from, colonialism in the beginning of racism. So anyway, that's my initial response, which, but I think there's probably a response here as well.
Just wanted to respond because your comment also might be when I were students here frustrated with the curriculum, and that led to us seeking out CRT and mentors who could help us to sort of understand and provide a lens of approach analysis for the things that we were seeing and experiencing with this classroom. And when I think back to that course that we had initiated, it was almost like 15 years ago, and to now see critical race theory adopted by the institution over time, like I feel like I feel fortunate to have that vantage point, but it is frustrating. And so I just encourage you to continue to validate your experiences and to connect with other like-minded folks. And that's a growing area that needs you, and other folks need you to contribute to that. So just wanting to plant that seed, like you already have it. And others are also calling for it. So seeking out other folks and continuing to push. Just wanting you to encourage you to do that.
Thank you. I mean, there's so many people in my department, in my classes, that do have disabilities and are struggling, and it's because of this inherent institutional ableism that is surrounding us as well. So it's really, but yes, it makes me think, okay, this crit, something that needs to be.
I think also, thank you, Cindy, for that. Sometimes you feel like you're the only one sitting in the classroom, and then, I'll speak for myself, like, you just get tired of, like, being that person, and like, oh, there she goes again. Just keep being that person, like, just whatever your insides are telling you, because sometimes I remember sitting in the classroom, and, like, my insides were screaming at me, but I stuffed it down, like, now it's just, like, for me, it's, like, listen to your insides and speak from your insides, like, I mean, yeah, people might roll their eyes, or, you feel that people are getting tired of it, but just keep doing it. Like, really, just keep doing it. And like you said, like, there's so many of you that, like, there is power in numbers, and, like, keep speaking that, that truth to power, and being that person, because I think, thank you. Like, that's what leads to things like this, and it does take time, but just keep doing what your insights are telling you. Thank you.
No, Susan, you go.
I was just going to say, related to that, it just shows how stubborn these systems are, really from, again, the professionalization of social work education. Like, we have to attend to accreditation standards of the university, or what does CAE say, and you have to have an official doctor's. You have to have all these systems in place, right? Where other communities, indigenous communities, have been taking care of each other for thousands of years, and they have systems to do that. So I think just the stubborn nature of us always having to buck up against some formality. And then sometimes students ask for, like, equal stuff or fairness, and we're stuck in the system of reinforcing that rather than treating individuals and being able to attend to each person differently. So I think there has to, if we're in a big institution like UCLA, it is a struggle because those systems are so stubborn and so entrenched. And then yet we don't want to create new systems. So how to figure that out, I think it is a negotiation between students and faculty. I just wanted to mention Bianca Wilson. I kept referring to you, but didn't say your last name, and is one of the scholars who has work on these topics as well. Sorry, were you going to say?
I was just going to add that, with my work around critical race praxis of rest, also remembering that it is exhausting. and that we do get to center our rest, and that we do get to call on those allies and accomplices that aren't currently navigating school as a student with disabilities, right? And what is their role to continue those discrit conversations? Because often we take on the role of, right, like I'm being oppressed, and I now have the role of teaching my oppressor how they're oppressing me. And when you're navigating with those marginalized identities, that to itself can just be exhausting. And so I encourage those of you who are not currently navigating as students with disabilities, what is your role in ensuring that discrit is included in the curriculum and the practices as well? I think we might be at time. Does anyone have any we are at time. So any closing sort of thoughts, questions? Yeah, please.
I have a question, but if we can, I work with you, I can ask you later.
We're not ready. I don't know if we're rushing, because
Yeah, please.
I think this is the last session of the day. So
I also don't want to stop people getting to lunch. So. Okay, so my question comes from having been faculty, so I'm a community psychologist. I was faculty in this law school for 13 years before joining my colleagues here at Social Welfare. And so I often was struck by kind of how much scholarship within legal studies resonated with me or reflected, say, theories and work that I was already familiar with. Like how much did it, was it filling a void in my current training versus, or my work versus maybe seeing parallel structures. So that's the background here that brings me to this question. I'm wondering, how much do you feel that critical race theory, given its, kind of legal, it made sense from Derek Bell and folks saying, look, lawyers, your form of legal interventions have a limit, and you need to understand the integral nature of racism in the Constitution, in the literal development of government in the U.S., so I get that. But is CRT, I'm wondering, for social work, for social welfare, and similar other fields that are kind of drawing from CRT, is it really critical race theory, or is this kind of just giving a language? I'm wondering, is this giving a language to what social workers were already talking about, or just not naming? Like when you name Ida B. Wells, when I think of Dorothy Roberts' work, I'm unclear why CRT is what gets grabbed in to name being critical of the racist foundation of social work. Why that? Why, so some, I don't know, this might be a little too professional, esoteric, why we make these decisions about how we bring in certain language and theories. But I think that's what I'm trying to understand, is because I'm also new to social work as a discipline. Do you really feel like there was a void in theory and language for naming that couldn't pull together the scholars that already existed? Or is there just also something useful in kind of choosing theory that people are now hearing to name something that's been ongoing, right? All of you have shown that in multiple ways, that the notion that we can be critical of the structures, whether it's related to disability, race, class, and gender, existed in the field already. So why this legal theory term?
I'll go quickly. I think coming from a social work paradigm into my doctoral work, which was in education, watching how the field of education utilized this, Salarzano talks about the lens, right? The analytical lens, the pulling of history, the language that we're given was really helpful for me as a new education scholar. And then in after graduation, which was in 2017, I went to a tenure track position in social work, right? So I'd been out of social work, quote unquote, for 20 years, came back into the social work department or the social work field and realized how archaic in many ways, and how we weren't using this as a lens and as an analytical lens, as sort of a roadmap pathway. We might mention sort of, oh yeah, and we know we're racist. And for many students, that was just sort of, even in their examination of intersectionality, sort of looking at my own identities, right? Like I can gather that, but for many students, they didn't sort of have what's next. And so for me, coming back to social work gave me language and direction and roadmap for how do we then use this lens to impact our practice. That was my experience. I don't know if that's helpful.
And for me, it was creating that framework and the language, because I was an ethnic studies person since I was an undergrad here, and really was fortunate to take so many of the foundational scholars that are here and in the law school. But when Larry introduced the CRT, it was the first time to have very clear markers of how to kind of place all these different things. In ethnic studies, there's a lot of history, there's a lot of this, there's a lot of that, but there's not like one theory, there's not one framework. So that was helpful to me. I think what we haven't done yet, and the book starts to, and I think it is more critical race studies than critical race theory. We probably should start saying critical race studies more. But like looking at the social work mechanisms. So in addition to the wealth building and poverty stuff, like licensure to me is like a really big thing that we need to dissect as something that is a liberal notion that's perpetuating inequalities, that's dismissing and erasing indigenous and other practices. So I think looking at applying it to social work mechanisms like they do to the law, I think we haven't gotten there enough yet. We've started to, and some of our chapters do.
Yeah, I think in many, go ahead, because you've had your hand up a little bit.
Yes, because I've been working not social as a social worker, but with violence intervention for 30 years. I went to Pepperdine Law for the MDR program. And every aspect of doing like development work intersects, especially when I work with gang members, it intersects with the law. All social worker in social services, everything interacts with the law. Right? So it just seems like to hit your wagon to recognize, and CRT is a recognized doctrine. It's why we're able to shift a lot of the laws that we did in regards to resentencing, right? All the resentencing laws, appellate laws that we've been knocking down in California for the past 20 years has all been kind of constructed around these concepts of critical race theory, which has broader kind of public health and social work implications and whatnot. So here's a model of CRT that is effective, recognized by the courts, that way, and I think that's where the efficiency is at, and that's where the power's at. When you get back to the corner, it's going to be a lawyer that comes in and says, "Oh, wait a minute, there's no critical CRT precedent," and you have to really look at it that way. And by doing that, I think they've armed themselves with a very, very powerful mechanism that even the president himself can't knock down. It's just promulgating. And that's how the law kind of feeds off itself. So I totally understand that.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Just something I wrestle with, that's why I threw it out there, but we're at time.
Thanks for the question, because I think it's a fantastic one. My first response is a yes and. I think yes, it is a new framework for us as social workers, and I think that's innovative. I think that social work lacks from innovation, and because it really doesn't have a strong identity. It doesn't. It's still very rooted in colonialism. I have just drafted an article where I call it Karenisms. It's rooted in Karenism, where there's all this outcry of justice, but then when you get right down to it, everybody's running from it because it's going to disturb their own world. And that's social work. So for many of us, the people of color in particular, because we've experienced a different kind of reality, we haven't always had the language, and CRT does provide a little bit of the language and the framework for understanding some of these things. It, however, does also give us an opportunity to, as I think we've talked about today, looking about innovation and going forward in establishing new ways of doing and knowing and doing. And so it's a little bit of both. I think, I think it is more critical studies because it's not a theory. I mean, it is a theory according to the way law defines theory, but not the way social scientists define theory. It's more paradigmatic. So we're growing, and it's messy. I think that's one of the things I wrote down while listening to my colleagues this morning is how messy this stuff is. But messy's okay. Messy's okay because, that's how we grow. That's how we find our way.
It's, oh, yep. I was going to say it's lunchtime.